Hello. Does everyone hear me okay? Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Anna Sale. This, of course, is Diane Rehm. Let's give her one more round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, for me, as someone who has been in public radio, Diane Rehm has been a standard bearer of what you want to do for your audience, which is to be a guide through the political squabbles of the day, the policy debates, the cultural phenomena. And in this book, she turns inward and is our guide to death, to grief, to losing a companion, to the questions you ask it as you realize that people around you are ending their lives. And it's a very honest book. It's very honest about not only grief and about the longing that comes with being a widow. It's also very honest about her long marriage and its 54 years of good times and difficult times. So I want to ask you first, Diane, your husband, John Rehm, died in 2014.
Right.
When did you first specifically discuss how you hoped to die together?
Oh my gosh, that goes back so many years. Even when our kids were teens, I think we would talk about it at dinner. I think we would, his mother died when she was 92. She took her own life. His father died at 72. He took his own life. My mother died when she was just 49. My father died 11 months later, truly of a broken heart. So I think we were both very familiar with and comfortable talking about death and dying. We certainly didn't try to make it morbid in any way, but John and I both had been very honest with each other that we did not want to live a prolonged life if one of us should have a debilitating or incurable disease. And so that conversation happened very naturally. It was sort of organic as part of our family discussions.
And your husband was diagnosed with a debilitating disease.
He was.
How was he diagnosed with Parkinson's initially?
Well, I hate to tell you, but I kind of take the credit. John retired from the law. He really didn't like the practice of law. He had been a Greek and Latin major in college, but knew he had to earn a living. So he, in fact, decided to go into the practice of law and went to Washington after a year on Wall Street, and then had 13 wonderful years in government with the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, which is where we met. So he decided he was going to retire after hitting age 70. And the January following, he did. He had prepared for his retirement for at least 5 years. He studied to become a docent at the Freer and Sackler Galleries. He had to attend classes for a year to do that. He became a reader for the blind and dyslexic. He became a volunteer for the hospice of Washington. So he would wait for me until I came home from work, and we'd go for a nice long walk in our neighborhood. And John was about 6'1". When we first met, He was built like a football player. My girlfriends always used to say what a beautiful physique he had. Big muscles, because he worked in his father's stone quarry on the farm, which we now own. So he was strong and big and had a good, loose body, easy walk, and a strong walk. And so all of a sudden, on these walks we were taking, I heard the beginning of a shuffle. And I said to him, Scoop, I mean, that's his nickname. I'll tell you why in a minute, but I said, Scoop, why aren't you picking up your feet? He said, I don't know. And that was it. Well, then I saw his hands beginning to shake. And he began asking questions over and over again. There is, in some cases, a certain amount of dementia that goes along with Parkinson's. In his case, it was very slight, but it was there. After he retired, we bought him a bright yellow Volkswagen Bug because he really wanted it. And he would take that Bug to all of his volunteer activities. And within 18 months, he had 3 minor accidents. At which point, the insurance company said, we're not going to insure it anymore. And John said, well, we'll just find another insurance company. And I said, we better have you tested first. Part of that testing involves psychological, diagrammatical testing, fixing a clock on a piece of paper. The doctor asked him to show a clock that signaled 10 after 11, and John couldn't do it. I mean, this brilliant man could not do it. And he was then given a driver's test. And the fellow who gave him the driver's test was also a psychologist. And he came back to where I was waiting and said, Ms. Rehm, I'd like to talk to you first before I talk with your husband. And he said, how do you think he's going to feel when I tell him he shouldn't be driving? He said, I almost stopped him 1 minute after we got in the car. He was on the wrong side trying to make a right-hand turn. He did not have full control of the car. So John said he was perfectly fine, not driving anymore, that it wasn't fun for him to drive anymore. So then the tests began with the neurologist at Johns Hopkins, the same neurologist who diagnosed my own spasmodic dysphonia, a man who we had long known and trusted. He became such a good friend, came to the apartment and to the house to see John, and that's how we got the diagnosis. But it was that shuffle. Mm-hmm. I heard it and I knew something was wrong.
His condition deteriorated. You did the home health aides coming in for longer periods of time. And for the last 2 years of his life, he was in assisted living.
Year and a half, actually, yeah.
What do you remember about that time when you'd been married for so long, and you're working full-time, you're hosting a radio show where you have to be so present and so focused, and then you have to visit your husband who's now staying in this completely different environment away from you. What was your daily life like during that period?
Distracted, because just about every single day I would get up at 5, I would walk the dog, I would fix breakfast for the dog and myself, I would go into the office, get ready to do the show. And you know, when you're doing an on-air live interview, you got to concentrate on what you're saying and what you're hearing, even more importantly. And I'd be distracted thinking about what was coming next. I mean, nobody else said I sounded distracted. I felt distracted. I felt as though I wasn't completely there, because every day, as soon as I finished taking care of everything I had to do at the office, I would head over to Brighton Gardens. And early on, you know, it was hard for him. We had always promised each other we would never go into a nursing home. We had promised that. And yet, the night he fell in our apartment, completely prostrate, and it took me an hour to pull him onto his knees and then drag him to his bed, and then somehow get him back up on that bed. We both knew that the time had come, and he apologized to me the next morning and said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." And he said, we have to talk. So when I got home that night, we decided that I and he would begin looking for an assisted living facility nearby. Not quite a nursing home. There are these labels that we tend to put on these places, but it is, in fact, a home of assisted living. He had a beautiful room. I picked out this room that had all light, windows all over the place. I chose the same fabric he had in our bedroom at home for his bedroom there, bought chairs, just did everything to make it as pretty and comfortable as it could be. But it's no fun. It's no fun to be in a nursing home. And at first, there were 2 other men that he sat with in the dining room. And they would have breakfast together, one of whose wife had Alzheimer's, and she was on the Alzheimer's floor, so she could not come downstairs to the dining room. Her husband had chosen to go into the facility with her, so he would come down for breakfast along with another gentleman, and the 3 of them would sit and converse about daily events in the news and what was happening, and that was fine. And then one died and the other moved away. And John really did not like being down there with people who he didn't want to talk to. So it got more and more difficult until I then went away, taking people on a WNYC NPR cruise down to South America. My son, who lives in Gettysburg, was coming down frequently. Friends were all with him day to day. And then one night I called from Buenos Aires, and it was about 10 o'clock at night. And I said to my friend, "How is he?" And she said, "He's not responding." And I said, "Well, what do you mean he's not responding?" And she said, "Just that. We've been here for an hour. He's not moving, he's not talking." I said, "Well, feel his head." And she did, and she said it felt warm. So they called the doctor, they called the nurse, the doctor left home, came, gave him an injection of antibiotic. He clearly had pneumonia. He got over the pneumonia, and 3 weeks later had it again. At which point, after that bout, he said, "No more antibiotics." So he's clearly here on a downward path. But within 3 months, he could no longer feed himself. He could no longer walk. He could no longer even get into a shower by himself. He could do none of that. And that's when he said, "I'm ready to die."
Can you tell me about that conversation? What did he say, and then what happened?
My daughter, my son, the doctor, and I had all planned to gather together in his room. My daughter is a physician in Boston, and she was on the phone. My son had come down from Pennsylvania. The doctor was in the room with us. And John said to the doctor very strongly, "I can no longer use my hands. I can no longer walk. I can no longer feed myself. I am ready to die. And doctor, I want you to help me." And the doctor said, "I cannot do that. I cannot do that by law, by ethical training. I cannot help you die." And he said, "But I can keep you comfortable." And Jenny on the telephone from Boston said, "Dad, we can keep you comfortable." And John slammed his fist down and said, "I don't want comfort. I am ready to go. I feel as though I have already descended into indignity, and I don't want to go any further." And the doctor said, "The only way you can achieve this is to stop eating, stop drinking water, which is the most crucial aspect, and stop taking medication." And I think for Jenny, it was probably the hardest thing to hear as a physician herself and speaking to her own father. "Dad, we can keep you comfortable." I'll never forget those words. But John didn't want comfort. In any case, he said, "All right, I'm going to think this over." And so the doctor and David left. Jenny hung up the phone. And John turned to me, and we just held hands, and I left, and the next day I came back early in the morning, and he said, "I began my regime today. I have not had any food. I have not had any water. I have decided to die." And I said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Absolutely. I am finished." And that's how the conversation went. On that day, I had brought him a photograph album I had made for him years before of his childhood in France all the way through Friends Seminary here in New York, where he went to school. And I got on the bed with him, and we looked at those pictures together and laughed and talked, and came back the next day. He said, I feel fine. I feel great, as a matter of fact. Second day. But by that night, he went to sleep, and he didn't wake up again.
Did you have to enforce his wishes with the medical staff there who's trained to intervene?
No, because the doctor himself put a very firm statement to the help. They are not trained medical staff. They are aides in that assisted living facility. And therefore, they were told John no longer wanted food or water, not to bring him even a menu, not to bring him a glass of water. And, you know, they came in once during that second day and said, Mr. John, are you sure you don't want some food or some water? And he said very sweetly, yes, I'm really sure. It is water. You can go much, much longer without food, but you cannot go without water. The lack of water breaks down the organs, and they will cease to function. So had he continued drinking water, he would have lived and suffered a lot longer. It would have taken so much longer for him to die. As it was, it took 10 days.
10 days is a long time.
10 days is a long time, and I was there every single day.
Do you think of that as him taking his own life?
I think of it as relinquishing his life rather than taking it. He chose his path, and he chose to do it in as peaceful a way as he possibly could. He would never, ever have used a gun. If he had had pills, he might have done that. If he had had a doctor prescribe medication for him, he would have done that. The doctor had already declared that he was within 6 months of dying, and had declared he was to be in hospice care. But that meant food and water and everything he needed. But that he would likely be dead within 6 months. John did not want to linger for 6 more months. And who can blame him? I can't.
Were you angry after he died that he couldn't have had, there was no more help to let him die faster?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. For me, what Brittany Menard did, leaving California and moving to Oregon because she had brain cancer, and she knew she was going to die in agony and did not wish to. She and her mother and her husband moved to Oregon, the first state in the country to adopt a death with dignity law, which means that 2 doctors must decide and agree that you are within 6 months of death. And then they will prescribe medications that you will or will not take if you choose. It's up to you. For John not to have had that option, I felt was so sad. And therefore, you know, though maybe outwardly he was not suffering, my God, to go without water, to go without food for 10 days so that you can die, I think that's pretty cruel. So yes, I was angry. I am angry. I am, however, optimistic that now that California has passed a right-to-die law, from which, by the way, the Medical Association of California decided not to contest, I am hopeful that we will all eventually have an opportunity to choose. I am not in any way advocating that anyone and everyone who has a fatal illness, who has a debilitating illness, should take his or her own life. You may be absolutely comfortable with palliative care, as Dr. Ira Byock has pushed for, and I fully agree with him. If that's what someone wants, that's what someone should have. But that's not what I would want for myself, and that's not what John wanted for himself. I think if we begin talking about this among ourselves, if we talk with our families as openly about death as we do about birth, both natural, ongoing parts of life, if we have the courage to do that, we will set in motion more action so that states will take the power from state legislators and put it into our hands, where I believe it belongs, for us to choose what we want for ourselves.
You write in your book about the process of choosing to become an advocate for death with dignity. You also write about the time after John's death and navigating this new landscape. And I want to ask you to read on page 118 the last 3 chapters.
You mean the last
3 paragraphs. Not the last 3 chapters. Don't be alarmed. The last 3 paragraphs.
I think our poor audience would have a hard time listening to me read 3 chapters. All right. With whom and how am I to grieve? With my children who've lost their father? With friends who ask again and again, how am I managing? How do I share the grief that comes in waves or that wakes me in the night? To whom do I say at those moments, how I long to see John, to hear his voice, to speak of my sadness? It is to him that I want to speak. Only he, after all our years together, can understand, and yet he is not here to hear me. My back is hurting. It's part of my grief. If he were here in this room, He would talk with me about the physical aspects of my grief. He would remind me of all the winters when, anticipating the memories surrounding my parents' deaths, I would experience terrible colds and take to my bed. He would encourage me to rest, to give in to the sense of loss, to allow my feelings to fill my mind rather than to push them away. And now, these thoughts are of him. At one and the same time, I dwell on the caring he showed me in our better moments, and the loneliness I felt when he chose to shut me out. The memories come together, the goodness, the love, the caring merging with the silence, the rejection, the sense of hopelessness. And what I realize is that that is exactly what my entire life has been about.
That passage to me, it made me realize for the first time when you lose a spouse after a long marriage that it's not only the loss of a companion, it's also forces you to reflect on the life that you've had, the life that is now over. That part of your life is over. And the mix of good and bad that comes with that as you reflect on those memories. How would you describe your marriage to John?
It was a marriage filled with so much joy, so much happiness, so much bitterness, so much anger. How's that?
We're going to have to unpack that a little bit.
Well, as I write in the book, you could not have chosen two more different people. John Rehm was a man who relished being by himself. I am a woman who loves companionship. Most of the time, I must say, since his death, I have grown so much more accustomed and comfortable and even happy being alone. But that was not the way during our marriage. John used his need for being alone as a way to keep me away. And as I write in the book, had I been a wiser young woman, I think what I would have done differently is to have understood better his need for aloneness and my need for companionship, and filled my life in other ways instead of relying so much on him to give me love, to give me happiness. No one person can be everything to someone else. You know, Hillary Clinton always said it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to make a marriage. It takes a village of friends, of companions, of people in the business world, of people in your medical profession, of people in your bookstore that you've become friendly with. It takes so much to make a marriage strong. Our marriage was strong in so many ways, and we have been fortunate enough to raise two healthy, wonderful, happy children. But ours was not what you would call a happy marriage. It was a difficult marriage. I have heard so many friends say to me, "I've never understood why you didn't leave." But I know why I didn't leave. I had a very early and short marriage to an Arab. My father and mother were both born in Mersin, Turkey. Syria did not even exist at that point. My father's family moved from Mersin to Beirut, Lebanon. My mother's family moved to Alexandria, Egypt. My father's family came to this country in 1911. My father, went back to the old country, to Alexandria, Egypt, for my mother, who just happened to have been engaged to someone else. Apparently, she broke that engagement. I have no idea why. I don't know whether my father promised her the moon or whether it was family pressure. But she came here alone. His family was all here. I married an Arab because my mother was dying, and she wanted me to marry an Arab. The marriage lasted 2 years. I think he thought he was marrying his Arab mother, and he wasn't. So we divorced, and I was working as a secretary at the State Department, and John as an attorney doing international trade work for my boss there at the State Department, and that's where we met.
We're going to open it up to questions in just a moment.
Oh, good.
But I have one last question. You write in the book also a lot about thinking about where you are in your career and the transitions to come. You are leaving the host chair at the end of the election.
That's exactly the way to put it, Anna. Thank you.
You're not retiring.
Right.
You make it clear.
Right.
And we're glad of that.
Thank you.
And you will be 80 at that point?
I will be 80 on September 21.
You will be 80 years old. You also talk about the stomach aches that come with sitting with financial planners when they bring the reality of retirement to you. And I just have a question about money, and that is thinking about the time when you were still working, you were paying for 2 households, including one in an assisted living home, and now when you're on your own, what feels scarier financially, that period or now?
Good question. I think it was scarier then, simply because I had no idea how long he might exist in an assisted living facility. The basic costs were over $100,000 a year. And anyone who's had someone you're supporting within that kind of facility knows that that's not the end of it. It's the beginning. We had to have extra help come in to be with him over and above what we were paying there. Sure, I was worried about it then, but he was such a good financial planner. From the beginning of our marriage, he started putting away money for the kids' college. So that by the time they went to college, of course it was a lot cheaper back then, But we had enough money to put those kids through college, so they didn't have to come away with a lot of debt. Jenny came out of medical school with half her tuition in debt. But I think now, knowing that these financial planners have really taken a very hard stand with me about what I can and cannot do, and knowing that I will continue on with the station, and even beyond that, I feel pretty comfortable that I'm going to be okay as long as I think clearly.
Does anyone have, is there a mic out in the audience somewhere? Oh, we're working on it. I can hand you my mic if you have a question.
Who's a question?
Don't be bashful. You see, the fact is that people are reluctant to talk about death and dying. Please.
I actually just wanted to thank you for starting the conversation. I don't actually have a question, but I really appreciate everything that you've shared. And just the comment actually on the marriage and the challenges of your marriage. It's really refreshing, and thank you for your openness.
Thank you.
I have a question. How far is the legislation going for death with dignity? I know it's spreading in the West. Is there any senators or legislators that are really behind it that you see some momentum?
You've got, even in the tiny district of Columbia, you've got Mary Che, who happens to be the councilwoman in my district, pushing it forward. You've got legislator Jamie Raskin in Maryland who is pushing it forward. You've got another bill on the table in Virginia. So around the country, you have Washington State, where it is totally legal. You have Oregon, now you have California, you have parts of Montana and New Mexico. So we shall see where it goes. I think that it's going to take our conversations. It's going to take our statement of desire to give those legislators the courage to believe that there is a desire out there for choice. I'm not advocating for everyone to go that way. All I'm asking for is that I have a choice, and if you want it, you have a choice.
Hi. Yes. So I had a question. You mentioned that you had joy in your marriage, and that you had an unhappy marriage, and I was just wondering, was there any happiness in this death or in the experience at all, would you say?
No. Not one bit of happiness to see him go. Even in his sickness, I loved going over there to talk with him. I'd pick up the phone every single day right after I got off the air and say, how are you? You know, what's going on? What are you doing? And slowly he got less and less interested in talking. But oh my God, oh no, no happiness in seeing him go, not even a speck.
So I have one comment, two questions. I hope the questions are quick. The comment is, I guess it's thank you, because my mom's been a widow for 26 years. She's 86. And I know not to call.
Your dad died young.
Yeah. Well, I know not to call while she's listening to your show. So she's dealt with a lot of loneliness, but I think you've comforted her. So two questions. You were going to tell us about why Scoop.
So, forgive me. Yeah, Scoop.
And then my other question is just talking about, I thought that was very interesting, talking about you're an extrovert, he's an introvert, but then you've become more comfortable with being alone. I was wondering if you could talk about alone versus loneliness as a
wonderful,
widow.
Wonderful. Okay, Scoop was Scoop because his father was the sports editor for the Paris Herald-Tribune, which is where his mother and father met in Paris. His mother was about 5'11", bright red hair. She was a runway model. And Pop worked the night shift for the Paris Herald-Tribune. So when John's mother was pregnant with John, there were 3 men whose wives in the newsroom were all pregnant at the same time. And John was the only boy born, so he became the Scoop. Is that sexist or what? Loneliness versus here's the thing. When I wrote my first book, Finding My Voice, I really did not like to be alone at all. In fact, it made me scared to be alone. When I was a little girl, and probably many of you have had this experience, I never wanted to go downstairs in the basement by myself. When I was 12, maybe even a little younger, a member of Congress sort of talked my mother and father into lunch and then took me back to his hotel room. And thank God I had the wherewithal to stand up and say, you know, I want to go home now. He had locked the door, and I went to that door and unlocked it and said, I want to go home. When I got home, I ran in the house and screamed at my mother, God, I never want to see that man again. He scares me. And she said, don't ever talk about this again. And she sent me off to neighborhood playground with my sister and never talked about it again until John and I met. I think that that was part of the fright of being alone. Every time I got on a streetcar, and we had streetcars in those days in Washington, I was scared to death I was going to see him. I was scared to death to walk up the block thinking he might be there again. So I think that sharing all that in that book, and then sharing it certainly with John, sharing it with my family, and living on my own even before John died, helped me get used to being alone with my dog, my little dog, who's gotten the worst rap because he bites. But now, I just come home and I think, oh my God, I'm so glad to be here in this quiet apartment where there's nobody else, where if I want to, I can turn on the radio. If I don't want to, I can just sit here. I don't know. I think I've gotten older. I've gotten more like John. And it's too bad that didn't happen earlier. Anna, you're shaking your head. This is my dear friend Ann Stonehill. And no, I haven't gotten more like John. Okay.
Fact checker in the audience. Yeah.
Fact checker. You had a question. I thought one of you did.
I have a question here.
Okay.
Sure. You had mentioned that when there was the conversation between your son, the doctor, and your daughter on the phone, that she reiterated the doctor's advice that John could be given comfort, and that for a doctor to allow a patient to end one's life is antithetical to a lot of their training. Has she sort of made peace with that, or was there peace to be made, and does she share in your advocacy, your daughter?
There was definitely in her voice that physician's tone. Dad, we can keep you comfortable. And I knew that was coming from her training, from her belief that her job was to try to keep a patient alive, even if it was her own father. She came down midweek when John had already passed into his coma. And she took his hand and she looked at me and she said, Mom, I swear he's giving me a squeeze back. She seemed fine with it after that. I think it was hard for her because she is a doctor and because she loved her dad so much. But I do think she's come to peace with it. Thank you for asking.
I have a question. You're staying on the program until the end of the presidential election. Do you find this election exciting? Is that part of the...
Exciting is not the word I'd use. I think it's the wackiest election I've ever seen in my life. And how it turns out, all I can say is God help this nation. I have no idea where we're going. I think that what I have seen does not give me a feeling of great security or great comfort. I find myself wondering what has happened to the thinking of people in this country. I don't know where we're going, but it sure doesn't give me comfort, and I hope that we will eventually get to the issues instead of to this craziness that we are seeing. And maybe in the next few days it's going to narrow down. After New Hampshire, I think you'll have a number of people easing themselves out. Maybe that will create a more rational dialogue, but we're not having one yet. And, I kept saying I was going to leave after the election. What I mean to say is that the end of the year will be when I exit. But we're usually on rebroadcast that last week and a half of the year, so maybe there's not too much difference there. But let's just hope our country stays strong and finds its way toward rational, thoughtful, careful behavior in choosing its next leaders. Yes, ma'am.
This is going to be the last question, but yes, I get to choose that. I was wondering, as a young person who is maybe considering having the sort of death with dignity conversation with my parents, do you have any suggestions about how to approach the subject? I understand that there's this rationalization of it's as natural as birth, but how do you broach the subject when it might not be that way in your family culture?
What I would do as an adult now, which I didn't do when my mother was dying, because in that era, my dad said, "You do not say a word." I mean, she had been sick for years, in and out of hospitals. The doctor had told me she was going to die. And my father said, "You can't say a word." Well, dear God. So I would start the conversation by simply saying rather softly, you know, I've been wondering how you all are thinking ahead about your own lives. And I've certainly been thinking about mine, you might be open to saying. I'm wondering, you know, how you would feel if you had an accident. Would you want to go into an assisted living facility? If you, I mean, John said once he got to the assisted living place, if I have a heart attack, no hospital, I'm staying right here. If I fall, I break my hip, I'm staying right here, no hospital. So, I mean, that's way, way more than a DNR, because hospitals don't pay attention to DNRs. So it's to you, the child. And I realize you're not a child, but you've got to be the adult who raises the subject so you know what they want. That's what you've got to know. So you don't end up thinking, oh my God, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what my parents really want. That's how I would start it.
Thank you, Anne and Diane, for such a touching and important subject and embracing it here. And Diane has to leave right after this. She's got another engagement, but thank you for signing all the copies. So if you guys want to purchase another one, they're there.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you all for coming out on this not very pleasant weather evening. And thank you all for being such a dear audience. Thank you.
Big fans of yours.